Okay, I think we're all here now. Good afternoon and welcome to this Tavistock and Portman Centenary event. My name is Lola Baba. Welcome everyone that's joining us today. I'm a psychoanalytical psychotherapist and I work in the City and Hackney service for the Tavistock and Portman. So welcome again. I'm going to repeat myself a few times, but welcome everyone. I hope that we're all in now and that you're settled in. We're going to start this by giving a little spiel of introduction about the Tavistock and Portman, a bit about myself, and then I'll take you through the day. So for the past 100 years, the Tavistock and Portman has been proudly at the forefront of exploring mental health and well-being, from attachment theory to infant observation, to applying psychoanalytical and systemic approaches in varied settings. Our ideas had led to changes in care, education, and beyond. This centenary festival is celebrating our history, exploring the contemporary issues in relation to identity, relationship, and society. I am deeply honored to be here today, to be co-chairing this event, both as a Black woman, as a mother of boys, and as a sister, a daughter, and many more status. And also, finally, as a mental health professional. I am happy to be kind of help guiding you through today, and please feel free to ask questions as we go along. Just write be mindful that the chats will be off. I wanted to introduce you to my colleague, and I'll be introducing a little bit to him in a minute. Tim, my colleague Tim Kent, who is a psychoanalytical psychotherapist and an adult social worker. Tim and I had worked together in the psychotherapy consultation service in City and Hackney. Our Hackney care service is like a forefront of psychotherapy. We take it to the doorsteps of our patients almost, in a way that, is almost like we are there on in the shop floor, where we take psychotherapy to the GP services, where patients feel able to access care in a much more effective and thorough way. So Tim, I'd like you to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Lola. Thanks for your introduction and welcome everyone. Good to see you all. We've got a lot of people who've joined us today and a lot of people who've shown an interest in this event, so we appreciate that. We're really trying to re-examine the history of statutory health services and the inequality in access to health services. In this talk, particularly for Black men. And we've invited Frank Keating not to sort of stand up as a lone expert, but to help us think about how we can challenge ourselves in the light of systemic structures, which I certainly feel a part of in our NHS Trust, the Tavistock and Portman, and the sorts of dialogues and re-examination of our own past that we need in order to have a better future. A future that gives better and fairer access, in our case, in psychological therapies, but more widely in terms of mental health. So our special guest, Frank Keating, is a professor of social work and mental health at the Department of Social Work at the Royal Holloway, University of London. And Frank's special research interests are in ethnicity, gender, aging, mental health, particularly focusing on African and Caribbean communities. He's recently completed a National Institute for Health Research funded study to investigate socially oriented approaches to mental health recovery for African and Caribbean men. And as you'll hear, Frank is a strong advocate for racial equality in mental health services through his writing, teaching, and public speaking. Now, I'm not sure whether Frank's with us yet. I think he is, yeah. Thank you, Lola and Ghazal. I also wanted to introduce Ghazal, who is our senior communications lead here at the Tavistock and Portman, and has been helping us put together this event and also sharing lots of her own really helpful and interesting ideas. And we'll come to. I'm going to be interested to give Ghazal a chance to respond to some of Frank's presentation in a little while. So Frank. Really good to have you here. You and I met about 30 years ago when I was your student on a social work course, and you taught me a lot. And I think lit my candle, as it were, for thinking about race and ethnicity, but also about how racism and structural inequality impacts on mental health. Frank, over to you.
Okay, Tim and Ghazal, thank you very much, and nice to meet Lola, and nice to meet everyone in the room. I struggled a bit to get into the room. Somehow it took me by my college username and not by name. So I was sort of sitting in the waiting room. So, but in any case, I'll see if I can share my screen. Right.
Frank, I can share your presentation for you.
I've got it up. Can you see it?
Not at the moment.
No. And if you share it, will I be able then to move forward?
Yes, so you can just say next to me.
Oh, right, that's going to be interesting. Because I've got it up, and I've asked to share my screen. Let me try again, because it says if it will stop you from sharing the screen if I share mine.
Okay, so I'll wait for your instructions, Frank.
Yeah, let me just see if this works. Can you see that now? Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation, and I will be talking to you about Black men and mental health recovery and taking an intersectionalities approach. So, of course, the context, Black Lives Matter has brought a lot of these issues to the fore. And of course, there's also the COVID pandemic, which we know has significantly affected Black and minority ethnic communities. And so that is the context in which we talk about mental health. And I've been trying to do a little bit of research to find out whether the mental health issues have been raised and addressed for BME communities in relation to COVID. And there's only two organizations who are highlighting this, and that's National Mind and the Center for Mental Health. And so, so we still find ourselves, even though there is the evidence around racialized inequalities, that the focus is not always there. So, just thinking about the context, we know that there's a long-standing history of disadvantage for Black and minority ethnic people in the United Kingdom. Now I'm using Black and minority ethnic. I know people are now using the term BAME, which I have some difficulty with some of the terminology, and I prefer to talk about racialized minorities. But today I'm focusing on African and Caribbean men. So in 2018, Theresa May brought out a report which was called the Racial Disparity Audit. And this report found that across all indicators of health and well-being, Black and minority ethnic people fared worse than anybody else in the country. So that's quite an indictment, I think, on our society. And of course, these inequalities are replicated in mental health, and I'll just remind you about these shortly. But this is also, I think, when we want to understand racial inequalities, we really also have to understand the whole notion of racial weathering. And this is a concept that was introduced by Geronimus, who was a public health specialist in the US, and she was doing work with young women who were pregnant. And of course, she found quite a lot of African-American women. And the policymakers wanted to just reduce the number of pregnancies. And she was saying, well, you can't reduce the number of pregnancies without looking at the context. And because what she found is that these young Black women who were pregnant at a young age were coming from disadvantaged groups, they were living in poverty, they were living in poorer households, and so therefore reducing pregnancy wasn't an easy option. You had to take account of these other factors. And this is what racial weathering is about. And it's this whole thing of something that eats away at the skin, something that eats away at the emotions, something that eats away at your health. And so racial weathering is saying that it's a process of living in a racialized society that accelerates your health vulnerability. And so living in a racialized society puts people at risk for poorer health and make them more vulnerable to health conditions. And so we have to understand that there's a close connection between living in a racialized context and your health. And if we don't, that's at the basis of some of this work. And therefore, racial weathering suggests that chronic stress, and I would say the chronic stress that comes from racism, erodes one's health, and that puts you at greater risk for health issues. And so therefore, we need to understand how social inequality translates into health inequality. We need to make the link between these two things. But also we need to also look at how people survive adversity, because I think what we know about health and mental health for Black and minority ethnic communities, we know about it from a negative viewpoint. We don't know about it we don't study those people who are doing well in society. We only study those who are not doing so well, because that's what gets us published, that's what gets us in the papers. So I would say that we also need to look at how racialized minorities survive adversity. So that's just the sort of backdrop that I want to put to you. So let's just quickly whiz through some of the disparities in mental health then. So we know that Black and minority ethnic people are 4 times likely to be given a diagnosis of mental illness and more likely to be given a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And even though in the general population, only 1% of the population is diagnosed with schizophrenia, but when you come to the Black and minority ethnic communities, they're 4 times more likely to be given a diagnosis. We also know that their pathways to mental health care for Black and minority ethnic communities are adverse pathways. They come into contact with services not via the GP, as all of us should. They come via the police, they come via the criminal justice system, and I can carry on. But also we know that because they oftentimes come to mental health services at a crisis point, and that's compounded by a lack of mistrust, a lack of seeking support. And so therefore the assessment process sometimes isn't as accurate as it could be. And therefore, Black and minority ethnic people also have poorer outcomes, and in terms of treatment, we have strong evidence that they are less likely to, and I'm pleased to be talking to therapists today, because Black and minority ethnic people are less likely to be referred for psychological therapies or for talking therapies. And my study that I'll talk about in a moment will bear this out for you. And we have this new thing called recovery. And this is now enshrined in mental health policy, but we see very little evidence of recovery in the Black and minority ethnic community. So I was quite interested to find out what does recovery look like for Black and minority ethnic communities. And this started by a piece of work that I conducted with people at the Center for Men's Health at the University of Leeds in 2011. And what we interviewed, we had 12 focus groups with men from Africa, with men from Black and minority ethnic communities. And basically, we wanted to talk to these men to find out how they understood emotional well-being. And so we interviewed two sets of men. We interviewed men who had no contact with mental health services, and we interviewed another group of men who had contact with mental health services. And interestingly enough, the men who had contact with mental health services talked about something which I termed the stalled cycle of recovery. And they found themselves in a cycle of disempowerment, which had all these things here. So reinforced stigma, an absence of trust, a lack of social networks, reluctance to engage with services. And so they had this challenge to recover. And so I really wanted to find out, what does recovery look for Black and minority ethnic men? And more particularly, I wanted to look at African and Caribbean men, because this is the group of men in mental health who is most significantly disadvantaged. And so people say, why don't you look at other groups? Why don't you look at women? And I said, well, I think if we can understand the issues for these men, hopefully this can translate into the issues for other men. And so I was successful in getting some money from the School for Social Care Research to conduct a study to explore this phenomenon. And I was interested in social approaches to recovery. I was not interested in clinical recovery, because when in the policy context, when people talk about recovery, I think they talk about clinical recovery, which is focusing on outcomes. It's focusing on medication compliance. And I think for me, when you take racial weathering into account, then the recovery is more than just clinical outcomes. It's a recovery that has a broader social dimension. So this is what I was trying to find then, to identify what supports recovery for African and Caribbean men from a diversity of perspectives. And also I wanted to find out how services across all sectors can be developed to support these men better. Now, I'm not going to talk about the second point. I will talk mainly about the first point in this presentation. But I need to just say something about hegemonic masculinity. We know that definitions of masculinity are embedded in our societal institutions. We know that it's white middle-class men who run our world, who make decisions about our world, all those sort of things. So definitions of masculinity are embedded in our institutions. And male power is institutionalized. You just have to look at who run our big companies. There are women who run our companies, but on the main, male power is institutionalized. But when it comes to Black men, they do not have the same access to this ideal. And so what we really have to understand, and this is where the intersectionalities come in, is it's not just about men, but it's about Black men. And they do not have the same access to the hegemonic ideal of masculinity. And so again, that's another idea that we have to grasp and have to understand. Sorry. So now I'll talk about the study. So first of all, we started with a literature review, and particularly the literature review focused on trying to find out what do we know about recovery in African Caribbean men, and unfortunately, very little. Very little came out from our literature review, so much so that I'm actually not able to publish the literature review because there isn't really much to publish. So it was a multi-site study. And so we had 2 sites. We had, well, 4 sites. We had one in Leeds, which is, I don't know if you can see my arrow. It's just over here. And then we had 3 sites in London. And basically, it was a qualitative study, and we used a phenomenological approach to analyze the data. And so what we did was we interviewed, or we recruited 30 African and Caribbean, 30 men who had to identify as African or Caribbean. They also had to self-define as being in recovery. So we did not give a definition of recovery. We didn't give a description of recovery. We just used the word recovery and said these men had to identify themselves as being in recovery from mental health. So this is really important issue here, that we did not have a definition, because what I really wanted to know from these men is what is recovery for that. So we interviewed 30 men, 12 experiences. I also wanted to find out about other people who supported them. And so we asked the men to nominate, in the first instance, a person in their lives. So it could be a family member, it could be a friend, a relative, who supported their recovery. And the men were able to nominate supporters in their lives. So 15 men nominated a supporter, so only half of the sample. But interestingly, when it came, and then we also asked the men to nominate a mental health practitioner who supported their mental health recovery. And overwhelmingly, the men said, I can't remember. This was my journey. So that's the first point to bear in mind here. Eventually, after explaining to the men why they wanted to talk to a mental health practitioner, 14 men then nominated somebody. But out of the 14, 12 men who nominated somebody nominated a mental health professional who were working in the Black volunteer sector. And only 2 people nominated a mental health practitioner who worked in the statutory sector, i.e. in the NHS. So that's, again, says something quite significantly in terms of what these men, how these men view the supports around them. And so I will move into presenting some of the findings here. And the first thing I need to say is that some of what I will say now is can be applied to other service user groups. But I think for these men, we have to understand how race, ethnicity, masculinity, and mental illness or mental ill health intersects to capture their lived experience. And so that's where the intersectionality bit comes in. We cannot just see them as people with mental illness or as men with mental illness. We have to see them as Black men with mental ill health. And that's for me where the difference comes in, because when I've done this presentation before, then people say, oh, but other men experience this as well. And I said, yes, they experience it that well, but Black men experience it qualitatively differently. And that's what we have to acknowledge. So I will now talk you through what these men said recovery means for them, and also what they said enabled their recovery. So again, it's giving the stories of the men. And also just to say, I took a participatory approach to the research. So what we did halfway, when we've done all our interviews, we, as a research team, we pulled out all the key themes. And then I invited some of the men who participated in the interviews back to two focus groups, one in Leeds and one in London. And we just gave them the findings and said, does this reflect your story and what do you make out of it? And so it was a co-produced study in that sense. So a life course journey. Now, interestingly, as I said at the start, I wanted to talk to these men about their recovery from mental health. And the men didn't want to talk about recovery to start with. They wanted to talk about their lives. They wanted to tell me about what's going on in their lives. And I said, oh, I'm here to talk about recovery. They said, I cannot talk to you about recovery without talking to you about my life. Those two things are really connected. And particularly men talked about racialized trauma. They talked about racialized bullying. They talked about fractured relationships in their early, and they said that all had an impact on how they then had mental health issues, but that also had an impact on how they work towards recovery. But also, if you see the other dynamic here, is that the men were also talking about their struggles in life, to develop friendships, to develop relationships, to maintain jobs, all those sort of issues. And they were saying that, these were fundamental to how they view their recovery. And then, of course, what they were also saying is that when they got into mental health services, so if you see at the top here, you see a little pill, you see the brain there. And so there the men were saying that all they got from mental health services was a depersonalized service. And somebody used the word that the mental health professionals were working towards a script. And the script was about compliance, the script was about taking your medication, and the script did not include their life history, their life story. So this was the starting point, is that if we want to think about recovery for these men, we need to think about their life course. And so what does recovery mean? And so the way the men talked about it, I identified this as something which I didn't produce the term, and I will show you in a moment. But the way the men talked about it, I was feeling that they were talking about social suffering that they were experiencing. And so just some of the things here. That on the one hand, they wanted to recover from this damage that society has done to them. It was not just their mental health issue they wanted to recover from, it's the damage that society has done to them. And the interesting thing, so if on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see a hand that shows stop, and a box of pills again. The one thing that men said that helped their recovery was coming off medication and staying out of hospital. And so I interviewed a young man who I think was about early 30s. And I said to him, so what has been your biggest achievement in terms of your mental health recovery? And he said, I have not been in hospital for the last 8 years. That is my achievement. I have not been on medication for the last 8 years. That has been my achievement. So it's really interesting how for these men, the medical way of recovery, they've rejected. They want something different. They've not denied the impact or the importance of medication. Some of them said, yes, I still take the meds because I have to. But what for them, a key dimension of their recovery was A, staying out of hospital, and B, coming off medication. So what does social suffering look like? So this is Bourdieu, who's was a philosopher, sociologist in France, and he introduced us to this term called social suffering. And I'm linking social suffering here with recovery. And social suffering refers to the pain and suffering caused by social forces. And the key social force in these men's lives was racism. And so we need to, and institutionalized racism, so we need to grasp that, we need to understand that. But it's also the interpersonal experience of suffering. So how the suffering that these men experience in society, how it transferred into their relationships with other people, with their families, with their friends, with their groups around them. And also social suffering is focusing on the contribution that society and its institutions make to the worsening of social and health problems. And this point I really like, and this drives my work, is that social suffering indicates that political, economic, social, and medical issues are inseparable. So we cannot separate the political from the medical. We cannot separate the social from the medical. We cannot separate the economic from the medical. They are all intertwined. And so social suffering, I think, is a concept that helps us understand these issues together and how they work together. How am I doing for time?
You're fine, Frank. You're doing really well.
Am I okay for time? Okay, good. Because I can't see a clock on my screen. Thank you. I'm getting there. So we asked this man, so what really supported their recovery? And the way they talked about recovery, we have identified what I now call the 4 pillars of recovery. And these 4 pillars are safe spaces, which is at the top here, identity, relationships, and agency. So the way the men were talking about is that these 4 things are the things that really help their recovery. And so I'll talk about each of these in turn. So safe spaces. Safe spaces for these men were spaces where they could be free from those social forces that I just talked about. So the challenges of living in a racialized society, the violence around them, all the trauma around them. And so for them, it was coming to a safe space was an important part of their journey because they don't feel safe in society. And so if for them to recover, they first needed what was called a safe space. And the safe space had some of these dimensions. First of all, they felt safe being with other men who had a mental health experience. They felt safe being with other men. And then they felt safe being with other Black men. And so, there wasn't really a hierarchy, because for some men, they said they don't have to be Black as long as they've had a mental health experience and I can talk to them. They don't have to be Black as long as they're men, because we can then share stories. And for other men, it was important that they also had to be Black men. And this was a safe space. So a safe space is where they could talk about their vulnerabilities as men, where they can talk about their vulnerabilities as Black men. And so that is the first point in terms of recovery for them, was finding the safe space. So really, really important. And so this is what one man said. He said, no disrespect to other races, but Jewish people understand Jewish people more than an Islamic person. Do you know what I mean? An Islamic person understands an Islamic person more than a Black person. A Black person understands a Black person more than a white person. So it's about, working with men and finding out what for them is a safe space, what for them will make the environment safe. And I think oftentimes our environments in which we work with men doesn't provide that safety for these men. The next pillar is negotiating identity, or renegotiating identity. And these men were talking about how they had to think differently about themselves. Once they've acquired this diagnosis of being mentally ill, their identity changed. And so it's about how part of their recovery was then renegotiating that identity. And so some people said that they had to stop seeing the old friends they've had. They had to find new friends. They had to find other people who could support them. So this man says, you associate yourself with people who support you. And he said, you might have friends that Mr. Hartman, and he believes he shouldn't seek help, or they believe he shouldn't seek help. They believe he should brush it under the carpet. No disrespect, but he said he didn't want to be around people like that. He wanted a new set of people who can support his recovery. This man says, I've learned to love myself and also to be around positive people, positive energy. And so renegotiating an identity is also to help people to either reestablish relationships or to build new relationships, but relationships that can be supportive to their recovery. In relationships that's not, that's more about collaboration and support, and not this rugged individualism. I'm the strong man, I'm the man who shouldn't show emotions, I'm the man who shouldn't cry. But it's it's developing relationships that are more based on collaboration and support. And you need to be able to do things by yourself, but you need genuine guidance, help with that. It's not about somebody coming around and saying, here's your food, here's your money, here's your medication. They wanted a bit more than that. Agency was then the next, the final pillar in this. And it's about men. And the men were saying that when they come into contact with mental health services, they have to give up a sense of control. And they were saying that it's really difficult to get that control back. But for them, getting that control back is what supported their recovery. So it's about living the life they wanted to live. It's about the things we all like: moving house, getting a job, meeting a girlfriend, being normal, just being able to go out and pick and choose like most people do. So the men weren't asking, pardon me, for things that are out of their reach. They were asking for things that we all value and things that we all appreciate. And agency is about being able to identify your daily things that you need to be on top of, and make potentially small daily decisions you might not have been able to make. So it's not about making big steps. It's about support with those small things that we all take for granted. And it's a process, but it varies from individual to individual. someone going to the shop to buy a loaf of bread, that might be a very severe task. For other people who take that for granted, they may receive a letter in the mail from a housing association. That may give them anxiety. So it's about really balancing those small things and how they can give us agency, or give the men agency. Okay, so I think that's probably where I'm coming to. So just wrapping up. So what are some of the implications for practice, since I'm talking to practitioners? I think, first of all, we need to acknowledge that the cumulative effects of racism on mental health, it's racism has this cumulative effect. It builds up, and if we don't acknowledge this when we work with people, then we're going to miss out something. We also have to accept that everyone has a duty to combat racism. It should be part of our practice. I would say practice that does not take account of racism is unethical. We need to adopt practice that is inclusive of diverse traditions. And as I mentioned earlier, we need to adopt a life course approach. And safe spaces, for me, starts with active dialogue. And if we cannot have active dialogue with Black men, we are not going to achieve a safe space for them. We need to enable them to re-engage with their social networks. And I think in mental health, we often, because we see people as adults, individuals on their own, we deny the fact that in the Black community, social networks are important. And I think it's important for every community, but I think more so in the Black community. And so it's about how do we help men to re-engage with their social networks. And of course, there's a new term called allyship, and it's about, that we need to make the struggle for against racism our own. As mental health practitioners, I would argue that we need to make the struggle for anti-racist practice our own. It's not somebody else's struggle. It's all of our struggles together. So all I can say is Black mental health matters. And that's a report. I think the slides will be available. But you can read a summary of the study in this little report. And so thank you for listening.
Frank, thank you so much. If people, the chat will still be closed for a little while, but if people want to show their appreciation or reactions, do feel free to use the reactions on the Zoom toolbar. Frank, that's something of a tour de force. You bring great humanity and pace and honesty. And in between some of the words and concepts you've used, there's also a great deal of pain, I think, and discomfort that we want to try and examine and think about with you all. So Frank, thank you for bringing your expertise and the amount of time and effort you've put into this research and the human stories, which I can see have been particularly touching and important. In a minute, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Lola. But for now, I wanted to ask for an immediate reflection from a personal and professional point of view to Ghazal, if you're there, Ghazal.
Yes, hi, thank you, Tim. Yeah, so I want to again thank Frank for joining us today. For me, my reflection is that your research provides a powerful evidence base that we're failing Black men. And it's a reality check for us, of those of us who work in mental health services. I myself, I'm not a clinician, I'm a communications professional and a writer. And my reflection is that you talk about the importance of acknowledging identity for these Black men and listening to their stories. So as a comms professional, as a writer, I know that I play a part in showing the importance of stories and documenting them through journalism, through photojournalism, so that we always recognize the reality for people and the reality of racism. And it's also a reality that affects the therapy room, because as a therapist, as a mental health professional, your reality and your life is not necessarily the same as the person in that therapy room. So we have to share these stories and we have to document the struggles so that we raise awareness about them. Tim has also asked me to reflect on some of my work in running these events for our Centenary Festival. So I've been running these events as part of a project team since September last year. And we've been making sure that race is at the forefront of these series of events. We've had 2 events on whiteness. And my observation that this struggle to achieve racial equality is really complex, it's messy, and it's painful, but it's a necessary process. And I'm seeing courage in that process. I'm also seeing denial. And we have to recognize that it brings up emotions, different emotions for different people. And one of my reflections, one reflection I thought was interesting from a colleague in our whiteness seminar was that she said that when a patient talks about racism in the therapy room, she feels a blankness. So to me, that was courage in sharing that in that seminar, that this is a difficult process. And I'm really excited about all the people who have come today. We had closed the chat off for the moment to allow everybody to focus on the presentation. But I know there are people here from different backgrounds, from academia, from local government, from the third sector, and just members of the public who are really engaged in this topic. So I would really invite you to kind of share your experiences and reflections, because with this series of events, you know, we've been able to really engage with people and we've started a dialogue, and I'm really excited to see that continue.
Thank you, Gazelle. That's really, really emotive. Thank you so much. Can I just say a big thank you to Professor Frank Keating. Thank you so much for making the time to do this. I am so touched and I'm very moved by your presentation. I think a lot of thought have gone into it. Tim and I are going to be doing like a reflective sort of discussion with Professor Keating for a couple of minutes and just sharing some of the thoughts and of what we've gathered from the presentation. I wanted to just start by saying something that I thought was really important, was to say that and I've mentioned this earlier, was that as a mental health professional myself, I found that I've had to started working differently. I look at my assessment forms differently. I use language differently. And I was thinking about what you were saying, Gazelle, about experiences, that our experiences are different from the others. And it's an important thing to not lose sight of that. What have you found, Frank, from those men that you've spoken to, what have they said has been helpful in terms of professional using the use of language, questions as asked, in terms of assessment process, for instance? Because I'm very keen on that as a clinician that does assess minorities, although we are also working to get more patients referred to us in that way.
I think there were 2 things that really struck me. So one of the men I spoke to after the interview, we had a little debrief, and he said to me, he said, "This was so therapeutic." I said, "What?" I said, "This is a research interview. I was not doing a therapy session with you." He said, "But you know," he said, "I have been in contact with mental health services for the last 12 years of my life. And nobody has had this conversation with me. Nobody has taken this much interest in my story. Nobody has given me the space to talk and just to be me." So that's the first thing. It's about, and that's why I said that life cycle, this lifespan approach is about giving men the space to talk about them. And the other point that men were making was, it's, you know, that they they disengage with services when people work towards a script. Have you taken your medication? Are you sleeping okay? Have you thought about suicide? That's a script. Yeah. So the men do not want a scripted service. They want a service that speaks to them, speaks to their identity, speaks to their interests, speaks to their needs. And that's why I said some of this applies to everyone. But particularly when it comes to Black men, you have to put it in the context of racial weathering.
Yeah.
You have to put it in the context of racialization.
Yeah.
You have to put it in the context of social suffering.
I think that's really helpful, really, because I think it then allows you to see things in a much more holistic way, which is what we're trying to do when we're doing the work as a psychotherapist. I mean, I think tradition, the way that I've come from different training in terms, I'm much more therapeutic community based, and my experience is about being alongside. So you want to get alongside the person, you want to get their experience, you want to get their story. But I think it is the use of language. It is finding the language that works to identify, to make sense for things for people. Thank you. That's really helpful.
Yeah.
Tim.
Thanks, Lola. Lots of thoughts, so many that I don't know where to start really. But and I think part of what I want to say as a leader and a director at the Tavistock and Portman is that we can't turn a blind eye and we can't offer a colourblind approach. It's not good enough. And as well as striving to be an anti-racist organisation, I think we have to think very carefully for white clinicians about how we approach an openness to racism in the consulting room and in our own minds and in our own experience. If we don't do that, we're effectively not creating an environment that has any potential for a starter, let alone continuity and care. And as some people have said on the chat, and Frank just said, people want an authentic experience where they can speak to their own truth and reality. They don't want a script. They don't want to be answering a set of questions or a tick box. People want to be able to be themselves. But that's difficult when there's a built-in systematic difference in both society in terms of racism and in institutional power. So how do we speak to that? How do we acknowledge it? And I'm reminded of something Michelle Obama said in relation to having couples therapy. She said, you need to bring your wounds, not your weapons, to the table. The thing is, if the table's sloped in the advantage of one person having more power, is it safe to open up? Or might you fear, in my consulting room, of being pathologized? That anger will be misunderstood for attitude. That tears will be misunderstood for weakness rather than vulnerability. That language or education makes a difference to whether someone is psychologically minded, as we say. And there's so many assumptions and stereotypes and unconscious as well as conscious factors. So we need to open our minds.
I was just thinking, one other thing kind of going along that side is that I'm looking at some of the interesting stuff people put in the chat boxes as well. You know, things about linking it back to the historical classic book Alien and Alienist, you know, and how this is a very old book, but yet still we are still having similar problems. So your finding and their finding is not dissimilar, Frank. And it's an important thing to say that the hope is that we at the Tavistock are hoping that we can be different, that we can start working towards something that is different. We are looking at how we're going to do use of language, the use of dialogue, the way that we take mental health seriously and different, because we are a psychotherapy service, but most of us come from a very concrete and a strong mental health background. And I do think that it's a very difficult topic to talk about. It's very emotive even for myself. You know, I've openly shared that I'm a parent. So I think when we're talking about this, we acknowledge that it's a difficult conversation, you know, but we want to keep having it. Just because it's difficult doesn't mean we stop it.
Yes, I see the chat going, and my phone is pinging like anything with the Twitter going as well. So, I just want to get back to what Tim was saying about you know, about the institutions, and I think a way of creating safe spaces is about co-production. And I have seen how co-production can bring results. So I'm working with the Wandsworth Community Empowerment Network in Wandsworth, and they are on a road of to just change the mental health landscape for Black and minority ethnic people in the area. And so the first thing that they started doing was, we know that IAP, the improving access to talking therapies, was introduced to encourage Black and minority ethnic people to come into the services, but yet when we looked at the statistics, they didn't show. And so what the Wandsworth Empowerment Network did was to work with the local mental health trust and say to them, look, if you train our Black pastors to do the therapies in the church, we can assure you you'll get people. If you train the people at the Gurdwara, we will get people. If you train people in the temple to provide the service in the temple, and guess what? The trust now is extending their service to the BME community, not in their nice little offices, but it's happening in the Gurdwara, it's happening in the local temple, it's happening in the local Somali community center, it's offered in the Black churches. And so again, but that's a co-produced service. And that's a service that again speaks to people's need. And so I think it's about also, I've always said, people, when people talk about particularly Black and minority ethnic communities, they say, oh, they're hard to reach. We are not hard to reach. You over-medicate us, you over-section us, you over-hospitalize us. So we're not hard to reach. We are reachable, but it's how you reach us. And so I think co-production, co-producing services for me is one way out of the institutional, what I would call paralysis around this, because I've seen in the chat somebody said, oh yes, we on the ground live with this every day, all the time. Yes, I acknowledge that. I'm not, and that's why I always say, I'm not saying something new, but I'm providing you just fresh evidence from the men. It's not my stories, it's their stories, but stories that they've not been able to tell anyone. And so it's about how we get people to tell us their story. And I'm a strong proponent of the narrative. And what is somebody's narrative, and how do we validate that narrative?
I wonder whether we need to reframe the language of hard to reach about the institutions. It's the statutory services that are hard to reach, and essentially need to reach out of the comfort zone. And I think people have made so many comments about this, and I want to just let you know that we do have time for you to speak. If there's lots of comments, and it may be more comfortable for some people to stick with the chat, but if you'd like to, please let me know, let Lola know, send us a message, put your hand up, just ask, because we'd like to hear your voices.
Oh, there's a hand up. Nathan, is that Nathan? Have I said it properly? Please unmute and speak. You can unmute yourself. Oh, Giselle, are we able to unmute them? She's going to unmute you. Nathan.
Hi there, am I unmuted now?
Yes, you are.
Okay, great. Well, I'll put my hand down then, first of all. Frank, thank you very much for a really, really interesting presentation. I'm a clinical psychologist and a psychodynamic psychotherapist. I work in Sheffield in the north of England. What I was interested in, additionally to what you're saying, which is fascinating, was your experience of being a Black researcher too, because obviously your study is a National Institute of Health research study, and of a very high standard. And I just wondered if you had any reflections on how difficult it might be to get Black voices into high profile research, which is where the kind of sort of recommendations for practice come from in the first place. We're all following a rather limited script in terms of the research that we have working in mental health services. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Is it Nathan? Yeah. Yes. I think the key issue for me is that I would not have been able to do this piece of work if I wasn't anchored in the Black community sector. We recruited people. I had a Black research assistant who sadly moved to Australia. So I lost him, but we spent time in the community. And so we recruited these men through local Black volunteer sector organizations. And so it was about the trust. It's about establishing a relationship with them. And that's what's important. So it wasn't a case of me, researcher, just going in and say, can you come and talk to me? It was about using respected networks within the community. And then what I did at the end of when the report was finally launched, it took a long time. I invited the men to the launch, and I invited them to come and speak and talk about their experience. And so it's also how we show respect, because sometimes what we do as researchers, we go in, we interview our people, and we leave, we write our nice paper, we get our big report done, and we forget about them. Whereas, I went back to the men, and in fact, the last time we met, the men said, "Are we not going to meet again?" Because the research became an important event in their lives. And so I think it's about relationships, and it's about how you use that relationship to the advantage of the people. And so, so I've used my privilege as an academic, but I'm using that to speak to practitioners about it. Yeah.
Thank you, Frank. I've also got Louise Goodbody. I'm Louise. I'll unmute you. There you are.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Frank, and everyone else who's organised this. I was particularly interested, I was interested in lots of things, but I'm focusing in this question on the intersectional nature that you flagged up. And I'm thinking about how your participants said that they had to let go of old friendships where there was the sort of strong man ideal, perhaps not the same as, but akin to the white masculinities of institutions, and had to develop new networks and stories for themselves about being more vulnerable and needing support. And I just wondered, did you have any ideas about what social resources or narratives they drew upon in order to be able to redefine themselves in that kind of Black masculinity?
I think maybe what I didn't say in the presentation is the men also talked about, something which they couldn't really name it, and they called it spirituality. There was a deep sense of spirituality, and how spirituality is the thing that pulled them out of this. And I don't think as mental health practitioners, we are skilled or equipped enough to really have those kind of conversations with the men. And it's not about going to church, and it's not. And I did a presentation to a group of people around spirituality and mental health, and somebody said, "Oh, but I can't go and talk to somebody about my religion." I said, "It's not your religion that's of importance here. It's not even religion, but it's about that deeper sense that people have about who they are, where they're coming from, what their journey in life is." And if we can't, as practitioners, and that's when we work towards a script, we don't engage with that side. And so for men, there was that element. And then there was the element about being validated. So, for example, when this thing about safe spaces came up, and I was running this co-production group with the men in one of the community centers, and they said, look around the center. This is a safe space. I see faces like me here. I see pictures like me on the wall. I see the food that I value. I see all those things. So I think Lola used the term holistic. I don't particularly like that term because sometimes we becomes fuzzy around the edges.
Yeah, I agree.
But it's it's about something that speaks to the whole person. And we all like food. We all like music. We all like those ordinary things in life. And so why can't we also make those things available to people with mental health issues?
Yeah. I don't know if I'm pushing this too far, but it almost sounds as though in some ways the spirituality and the validation enabled people to release themselves from a narrow identity politics definition of themselves.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I've got a few hands up. I'm just going to kind of go around. I know there's a Vivian. Should you put your hands up? I can't see you. Would you unmute, please? If you're there.
I can see Catherine and Trish having their hands up.
So Trish, would you go ahead, please, and unmute? There you are. Okay. Yeah, and then lower your hands, please, Trish.
Yeah. Sorry, trying to do all that on a very small laptop. Thank you very much for that talk. I thought it was really incredibly insightful. I really liked the parts at the end, which were talking about implications for practice. So how do we change our practice so that we can try and incorporate some of these ideas for helping that community in future? And it got me thinking about, firstly, the point you've made there about the accumulative effects of racism on mental health for Black men. That starts from such a young age, from 3, 4, 5, as soon as that sort of, this person's becoming actually quite big and I'm now frightened sort of look that people sort of give those Black men, that they then have to carry on until their later years. Are clinicians taking all of that into account? And then the other thing I was thinking about is about how do we get GPs to start referring Black men to our services, because the sorts of things that they need in terms of the space to talk, that's one of the services that we run in the service I work with. They're given that sort of space to talk, but they're not being referred. And how does that change so that we get services like teams around the practice to actually educate these GPs to say, these are the services that are going to give these safe space to talk. We then need to think in our service about how we make those spaces safe by educating our mental health practitioners.
Yeah. Thank you.
Vivian's back. I can't see her, so I'm trying to find Vivian because she has been raising her hand forever. She cannot unmute. So I can't see her. Well, Vivian, maybe type your question in the chat for me, please. In the meantime,
it's working now.
It's working. Well done.
Yeah. Hi. So yeah, thank you, and thank you to everyone for organising the event. So I just wanted to say, I guess it's really, I was so excited to see the event because there's so much literature talking about the statistics and how difficult the Black male experience is. So just really thank you, Frank, for moving past that literature and actually looking at the solutions. And I guess my question is based on that. How can we continue to move the literature beyond looking at the problems, and what kind of direction do we need to go in to keep creating these safe spaces within literature? So we've got kind of evidence-based, but also within our services. Is it more important that we incorporate these, or is it about going to communities and third sector organizations and wrapping around them? So just to kind of get your idea on that.
Yeah, thank you, Vivian. It's a really important question. So I can only talk about what I'm doing at the moment. So I don't know why I put myself up for this, but next week I'm speaking at a series of talks around what does anti-racist mental health research look like? And I think we need research that is not just focusing on the overrepresentation, because we know that. We need to ask different questions, and we need to look for different answers, because we know the overrepresentation, we know all those sort of things, and we now have a new mental health act consultation. So please, if any of you listen today, can you go onto the Department of Health website and respond to the consultation? We need to respond to the consultation. It's open now. We need to respond to it. But so I'm looking at how we can make our research more attuned to the people we are researching. And I'm hoping that in this study, this is what I think I've achieved, or you can tell me whether I've achieved it or not. But so that's one way of doing it. But I think, again, it's about validating people's stories. We all want our stories validated. We all know what it's like to walk into a room and to be ignored. We all know what it's like to talk to somebody and they don't listen to you, and you say, but you're not hearing me. And so it's about how we give ear to people's narratives and how we give voice to people's narratives. And so people have also said that Black men don't talk about emotions. I've done a photo voice project, again with Black men, and this was published in the Journal of Qualitative Social Work. And where I had 19 men who took photographs just about things in their lives, and they were able to talk about mental health quite openly, no problems. So it's about starting that conversation, but finding creative ways of having that conversation is the important thing. Yeah.
Thank you, Frank. I've got Jason Shonian. Is it Shonian? Jason, would you please unmute and talk? I know you've been raising your hand for a while. Apologies for that.
Jason, you are still on mute?
Yeah, I can't find you. Bad coordinator, hey? If I move on, Frank, just in terms with time, I've also got someone else. I've also got Jodine.
Well, and Catherine has been sitting patiently for a long time.
Okay.
Right. And so is Ingrid.
Why don't you unmute you?
Yes, thank you.
Go for it.
Thank you. I want to say thank you so much for putting this seminar on. And I really, really value your work, Frank. I've been involved in doing work in the community. I was brought up in St. Paul's. Since the 70s, I've been involved. And it's been driving me all the stereotypes that we've had to put up with. And as a counsellor, I've managed to get a lot of Black men, because I've grown up in the area, to talk to me. I went off to Australia for 6 years and I came back 2 years ago. And what you were talking about how the policies, the institutions make the situation worse. I saw what happened to the Aboriginal people, where the institutions which were supposed to be helping them was throttling them by the stereotypes. And this thing about not understanding their spirituality or taking it as a joke or trying to put ideas onto people that didn't belong to them. I saw how it was damaging them. So I got into trouble with the authorities there for speaking out. And in Bristol, I'm seeing the same. I've got now clients who, I've never heard about things like social suffering, which is so true. Social suffering, the role of the institutions in making it worse for us. And this thing about Black men not having to take on this pseudo masculinity of what it means to be Black. I had a bookshop in St. Paul's and I can remember all sorts of people coming to talk to me. And one young Black man, this was back in the 90s, saying to me, look, Catherine, for example, I perm my hair because I see it as being more acceptable. He said, I find when I'm talking to my white colleagues, I have to put on a different language. And all of that is driving people crazy because they cannot be their true selves. So now I teach yoga. And one of the things I do, I've got another friend who's a Black male who teaches yoga. So we're going to start yoga courses for Black men, because so that they can reconnect in a safe space with themselves and their spirituality, not having to have a tough image, which has nothing to do with them. And what you said about the idea of power comes from institution, I'd never thought of that. You know, that's because in my time in Bristol, where I've seen more strong Black men is when I used to go to Hewlett Packard, when my ex-husband worked there. And I could see those men with their jobs who were so proud. But we haven't got, anyway, I'll say less, but thank you, thank you, thank you. And I'd love to get in touch with you after this. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Louise. I'm going to, Jason's here now, so I'm just going to unmute him. I've just see Jason, so you should be able to speak now, Jason. You there? Oh, well, I'm really rubbish at this. If anyone else can help me, it would be wonderful.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Jason. Hi, Jason. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, organizers, and thank you, Frank. It's really, really nice to be here. I wanted to introduce myself quickly. I'm Jason. I'm training to be an educational psychologist, and I'm in my 3rd year. So I'm doing research, actually, Frank. And I picked intersectionality as well, looking at how it connects with people from a BAME community and who have got a special educational need or disability. So I was so pleased to see the topic title. And I think it's super important to bring these ideas that I think you mentioned, hegemonic masculinity, and this idea that not every Black man's experience will be the same. Not every man's experience will be the same. Not every person with a disability is the same. And I think that's so important to kind of bring that individuality. I guess for me, my question was really about, as a researcher and as a Black male, and as someone who's finally made it on a course that I've been trying to get onto for a long time, in doing my research, I've really wanted to challenge some of the institutions, the schools and the further education settings that are essentially not supporting as best possible certain communities. One of the things that I found, though, is that there's a big resistance to intersectionality. I kind of want to ask you the question about, if people are struggling to come to terms with how racism is systemically embedded in their institutions and organizations, how do you think, Frank, that we can begin to unpick that? Because there are bigger prejudices or double oppressions that are happening against certain groups or minorities within minorities. If people aren't ready for the racism talk, how are they going to be ready for the intersectionality talk, is I guess my question.
Jason, that's a really, thank you for the question. It's a big challenge, it's a big ask. I think my answer probably may sound like a cop-out, but I think, you know, racism isn't nice. And so talking about it can't be nice either. And, you know, so this whole new thing that we have about unconscious bias training, it doesn't do anything because we're not talking about the real issues. And so I think, and again, I come back to the narrative, and it's about allowing the narratives to be heard and allowing the narratives to be respected. That for me is the important thing. And I take a leaf out of Lee Jasper, who used to work with the London Mayor of London's office a while back. And he was always saying, institutional racism demands institutional reform. So I think it's up to us, you know, we really should not avoid challenging the institution. The institution may look more powerful, but the institutions are made up of us. And so it's about how we use our privilege within institutions to challenge. Yeah, so that I mean, it may sound like a cop-out, but I think that's what I think we just need to carry on, you know, and I know somebody in the, early in the chat said, oh, we've been there before, we live this, we do this. But as long as it's here, we still have to challenge, we still have to fight. And I see Pramila in the room, and hi Prem. And you know, I've worked with Prem a long time, and we both get fed up of this. But then we fall down and we stand up and we carry on. So I would say, you're young, you've got it ahead of you, just keep going. Just keep going.
Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Oh, sorry, after you, Tim.
Sorry, just to say, we know, there's a B for burden, I think, in this, and it is burdensome. And, I suppose what I wanted to say was we appreciate your stamina in keeping on, yeah. And recognize that is hard. That's part of the battle. And I think in putting on this event, we're trying to challenge our own structures and story and narrative at our own institution called the Tavistock and Portman, which is a long time coming and hard work. And boy, have we got a lot of work to do. Lola, sorry, back to you.
No, thank you so much, Frank. I was just going to say that, how powerful these events are being to kind of find dialogue and to find language for things that we don't really like to talk about and things that are really hard for us. I was just thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement, affect us out of mental health. I know there's still lots of people with their hands up, so I don't want to put my thoughts to that. There's somebody called Bankole, which I will pronounce properly since it's a Yoruba name. I'm just going to unmute him. Finally, if I can get yeah, there he is. So you speak Bankole, and then I've got other people's name up, but Bankole has done his hands up for ages.
Thank you, Lola. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, and thank you, Frank. Thank you for everyone who put the event on. There's just so much. What can I say? The biggest. I'm a final year student studying humanistic integrative counselling, and I think the big things that you said that I really appreciated was I'm not a fan of the term BAME as well. Just like Jason was saying, it kind of puts everybody in one box, and I believe as a Black man I have a different experience than Asian and so I feel like we should be separated and my story should be told, and that's what came out for me in what you said. Trying to hear my story, speaking to people that look like me, I find it much easier. And so to that, I think it's more to the Tavistock. My thing with any of these types of events is, what's actually the next steps? It's great to talk about this, but at this stage of my life, I'm 46. I would like some clear action. What are you actually going to do? We can talk about it, but what's the actual plan for the next steps to make mental health more accessible to people of color? And one of the things is obviously to have more people of color. So to that end, are there bursaries in place? Are you actively trying to make it more accessible to people of color? Because those are the questions. And places like the Tavistock, Metanoia, and the Minster, these institutions have an opportunity to do this, and that's really what I wanted to say. But thank you for your research, Frank.
Thank you.
I think that's an amazing question. Just to confirm, for me, when I was doing my psychotherapy training, I certainly did get some bursary, but this was something that I didn't know even existed. I was encouraged to look for it. So, but this was not at the Tavistock, so just to say that. So there are bursary out there, you just have to look for it. I know that there's lots of people that've got their hands up. I've got Ingrid Collins. Let me find Ingrid. Ingrid, please unmute, but I'm going to try and find you myself.
She's unmuted already.
Well done, Ingrid. Thank you. You're way better than I am.
Thank you. That was a very nourishing presentation, and I thank you very much. As a background, I am a consultant educational psychologist, practitioner psychologist in private practice. I'm also a registered healer, and there's been some mention of spirituality here, for which I'm very happy about. Spirituality isn't an airy-fairy thing. It's an energy, an awareness of energy, and a use of energy that I work with every day. And it's one way of connecting that is so profound and so effective. And it supports the therapeutic conversation as well as my work hands-on with clients. How much is generally known about the reality of spiritual energy versus how much is talked about? There are different aspects and different interpretations in different cultures. And my concern is that when folk of different cultures, whatever their culture, bring their spiritual understandings to the therapeutic room, they are diagnosed quite often as hallucinatory fantasies, medicated or labeled, rather than the therapist having training and understanding about spiritual phenomena. And so my question is, how much training is done, and how much is really in the general conversational therapeutic community about the reality of spirit? I'm a past president of the British Alliance of Healing Associations, and I'm also a member of the parliamentary group for integrated healthcare, where we're slowly making inroads into awareness, but it's a long, slow process. But I'd welcome your thoughts about it. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm not in training psychotherapists. I train social workers, so I'm in the Department of Social Work, and for us, and I teach race and mental health, and for me, spirituality is an essential component of getting my students to understand it and getting my students to grapple with that. But I don't know if Tim may have a response to you on this. Yeah.
I think probably not right now, simply because we're in our last minute, and I know that. So I'm not dodging it. You know, I'm very happy to speak, and perhaps get in touch with me outside. But we're going to have to close in a minute. And I know Lola and I, want to give our heartfelt thanks to Frank and all of you for engaging and joining us and having such an open dialogue. We know it's not enough. There's about 10 hands up already. Lola, over to you and Frank.
Can I just say a big thank you to everyone, a big apologies initially, just to say to those who I've missed, it's not been done unconsciously or consciously. It's just that these things happen in situations like this. But please do carry on writing in the chats, and we might be able to reply to some of your questions if we need to. To thank you, Frank, for making the time to speak for something so difficult to talk about, and giving space for all of us to have a dialogue about these experiences. I'm sure that everyone would like to give you a round of applause. I certainly would. And thank you again. And thank you everyone for making the time to attend this event.
Well, thank you very much for listening. And I'm terribly sorry that Joden and Pramila couldn't get their questions answered, but you can email me if you have a comment. And Prem, it'd be lovely to hear from you. And thanks, Lola, and thanks again, Tim. Tim, my slides, you can circulate that. I don't know whether people will make sense of it, because my slides are normally just for me. But I'm happy to share it if you want to save it as a PDF and circulate that. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your time. Again, apologies again for those that I've missed. And please do join us on our next centenary events. There's loads more to come, so please do feel free. I believe that we have an event coming up. Got my list. We have an event coming up in the 8th of February, and please look out for that. And thank you, everyone, and goodbye.